"You're too ordinary to be taken seriously by the people I want to impress," she said. I smiled and left without defending myself. 10 months later, she watched investors line up to meet me during a conference she attended as an employee. "You're too ordinary to be taken seriously by the people I want to impress." She said it the way someone might comment on the weather. Casual, certain, like it was simply a fact she had grown tired of keeping to herself. I didn't respond right away. The restaurant around us continued its quiet Friday evening rhythm. Silverware touching plates, a couple laughing 2 tables over, the low murmur of a jazz track playing through speakers mounted somewhere near the ceiling. None of it paused for us. None of it acknowledged that the woman sitting across from me had just said something that would echo in my chest for months. Andrea was looking at me with that expression I had started recognizing over the past several weeks. Not unkind, exactly, but distant. Evaluating. The way you look at something you're considering returning. I set down my fork. I remember noticing the candle between us. Small, half-burned, throwing unsteady light across the white tablecloth. I stared at it for a moment longer than was probably normal. "Okay," I said. That was it. Just that one word. She blinked. I think she expected something more. Pushback. A defense. Maybe even anger, which would have been easier for both of us, honestly. Anger has edges you can grab. Silence just sits there and fills the room. "Marcus," she started. I shook my head once. Not aggressively. Just no. I picked up my glass, took the last sip of water, and set it down with the kind of deliberate care that surprised even me. My hands were steady. I noticed that too. I had expected them to shake, but they didn't. There was something beneath the disappointment that felt almost like recognition. Like a part of me had been waiting for this sentence without knowing it was waiting. I smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a sarcastic one either. It was the kind of smile that comes when something finally becomes clear, when a feeling you couldn't name suddenly has a shape. I should have argued, I thought, looking at her across that small table. Instead, I smiled. I left $40 on the table, enough to cover my half and the tip. I pushed my chair back quietly, stood up, put on my jacket, and walked out of that restaurant without defending a single thing about myself. The cold air outside hit me immediately. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in my pockets, looking at the street. A cab passed. A woman walked a dog. Somewhere overhead, a siren moved through the city and faded. I had been with Andrea for 2 years and 4 months. And somewhere in those years, without either of us marking the exact moment, I had become someone she needed to explain away. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was what I had been quietly building in the months before that dinner. What I was going back to that night, sitting at my desk until 2 in the morning. What would, 10 months later, cause investors to line up to shake my hand at a conference she attended as an employee. But I'll get to that. You have to understand that it wasn't always like that. We met at a friend's birthday gathering in Brooklyn. Not a party, exactly. Just 8 or 9 people crowded into a small apartment with good wine and better conversation. Andrea arrived late, which I would later learn was characteristic, and she apologized to the room with a kind of easy warmth that made you immediately forgive her. She sat across from me, and we somehow ended up talking for 3 hours about a documentary she'd seen on urban architecture, which led to a conversation about cities in general, which led to one about what people are really looking for when they say they want to move somewhere better. "They're not looking for a place," she said that night. "They're looking for a version of themselves that place makes possible." I thought that was one of the most perceptive things I'd ever heard someone say at a birthday party. By the end of the night, I'd given her my number, and she'd actually texted me on the walk home. Just 3 words, "Still thinking about cities." We were good at first. I want to be honest about that, because it's easy in retrospect to flatten someone into their worst moment, and that's not the truth. The truth was that Andrea, when she was fully present, was sharp and funny and capable of a kind of genuine enthusiasm that made everything feel slightly more alive. She loved obscure documentaries. She made excellent coffee. She remembered the small things. If I mentioned I had a difficult call coming up, she'd text me afterward to ask how it went. She had a laugh that seemed to surprise even her sometimes, sudden and unguarded, and I loved catching it. We had routines that felt earned. Sunday mornings with the newspaper spread across the floor. The Thai place on Thursday nights where we always ordered too much and ate leftovers standing over the counter the next morning. The way she'd read aloud from whatever book she was halfway through, not to share it with me necessarily, but because it helped her think, and I had learned to just listen. I told Devin about her after the 2nd month. "She sounds like a lot," he said. "She's a lot in a good way," I told him. He gave me the look he gives when he's decided not to argue yet. The early warning signs, I can identify them now with the particular clarity that only distance provides. At the time, they blurred into things I categorized as ambition, which I respected, or personality, which I accepted. The networking events she wanted to attend, constantly, that was fine. She worked in brand development, and connections mattered. The way she'd assess a room when we walked in somewhere, not looking for friends exactly, but for relevance, I told myself that was professional instinct. The habit she had of mentioning, casually, what other couples she knew were doing, where they were vacationing, what apartments they were moving into, how one of her colleagues had just been featured in a trade publication. I told myself she was curious about the world. And then one evening, maybe 8 months in, she said something that I filed away and tried to forget. We'd been talking about a mutual acquaintance who'd left a stable corporate job to start something of his own. I thought it was admirable. She tilted her head slightly. I just think, she said, choosing words carefully, that you have to be someone before you can afford to do that. Otherwise you're just unaccountable. I remembered something about how she said it. Not what she said, but the slight edge under it, the quiet implication. At the time, I laughed it off. I remembered it later. Much later. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. The change wasn't dramatic. I want to be clear about that because dramatic changes are easier to respond to. You see the line clearly, you decide which side you're on. What happened with Andrea happened in degrees so small I kept second-guessing my own perception. She started getting invited to a different tier of events. A colleague introduced her to a circle of people who occupied that particular New York stratum where money and influence and creative work intersected, and she moved into that world with an ease that genuinely surprised me. She was good at this, I'll give her that. Andrea could enter a room and within 20 minutes have identified everyone worth knowing and positioned herself credibly within 3 conversations. It was a skill I didn't have and had never particularly wanted. The invitations started coming for her. Industry dinners. Launch events. A charity gala where the ticket price was disclosed only as suggested donation. I went to some of them with her in the beginning. I stood beside her at cocktail hours and made conversation and tried not to feel like a prop she'd brought along and then forgotten about. You don't have to come, she said once, which I recognized, too late, was a different statement than I want you there. The comments began appearing somewhere in the 14th or 15th month. Small ones. Delivered in passing. Not designed to wound, but wounding nonetheless. You really should think about your LinkedIn. You know how people check those things. You're so comfortable with just being where you are. I admire that. Said in the same tone you'd admire someone's ability to stay calm at a dentist appointment. Some of the people I know from last night, they run companies, Marcus. Real companies. But you do your thing. You do your thing. I kept absorbing these comments the way you absorb a slow draft. Not cold enough to complain about, but cold enough that eventually you feel it in your bones. Devin came to this conclusion long before I was willing to. We were at a bar on a Wednesday evening, just the 2 of us, when he set down his drink and said, with the particular directness he reserves for things he's been holding back, "She's embarrassed by you." She's not. Not maliciously, he said. But she's decided what her life is supposed to look like, and you don't fit the picture she's building. You've met her 3 times. I know, he said. And all 3 times she's done this thing where she mentions what other people are doing in a way that's really about you not doing those things. I told him he was reading too much into it. He didn't push. He just picked up his drink again and said, "Okay." But the thing about Devin is that when he says okay in that particular way, he means I'm right, and you'll see it eventually, and I'm not going to make you feel worse about it than you already do. I didn't defend myself to her. I didn't confront her with the comments. I told myself that I was choosing my battles, that I was secure enough not to need external validation, that relationships went through phases. All of those things were true, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was that I was already consumed by something I hadn't told her about yet. I didn't realize it then, but she had already started leaving. She was just doing it quietly, the way I did everything. Except her silence wasn't peace. It was preparation. The breakup happened on a Tuesday. Not the dinner at the restaurant. That came later. That was the public declaration. The actual ending happened at her apartment, with both of us sitting on her couch, a show paused on her TV, and Andrea with her hands folded in her lap like she was in a meeting. "I've been thinking," she said, "about us, about where this is going." And she looked at the paused television for a moment. I think I need to be around people who are more aligned with where I'm heading. I nodded slowly. Okay, I'm not saying anything is wrong with you. You're just saying I don't fit. She hesitated. Then, I'm saying we want different things. There was a long silence. Outside her window, the city made its usual noise. Can I ask you something? I said. Of course. Is it that we want different things, or is it that you're not sure I can get to the things you want? She didn't answer right away. And her hesitation, the fact that she had to think about it, the fact that there was any pause at all, told me everything. I think, she said carefully, that you're very comfortable being where you are. There it was again. That sentence. That same framing. We sat there for another 10 minutes of conversation that was really just the administrative end of something already concluded. I left her apartment, walked 4 blocks to the subway, and stood on the platform alone, trying to understand why I wasn't angrier. What followed was the social media version of it. Andrea posted things that weren't directly about me, but were clearly for me. Inspirational captions about alignment, about choosing people who match your energy, about not shrinking to make others comfortable. Her friends left comments with fire emojis and hearts and affirmations. Mutual friends called me. Some were supportive. Some clearly wanted information, the specific currency of a good breakup story. I gave them almost nothing to work with, which I think frustrated more people than I expected. You're being so calm about this, one of them told me. Yeah, I said. Does she know something you don't? I thought about it. No, I said. I know something she doesn't. And that was the truest thing I said to anyone for months. There was one thing I never told anyone. Not Devin. Not my family. Not the mutual friends who called. What I had been doing, quietly, before any of this became the ending. 4 months before the restaurant dinner, I had signed a lease on a small office space in Midtown. 1,200 square feet, fluorescent lights, a heating system that made us sound like it was considering giving up, and just enough room for 3 desks and a whiteboard that was covered in diagrams within the first week. I had been working on a software platform for operations management in mid-sized logistics companies, the unsexy middle ground between the giants who have enterprise solutions and the small businesses that are still running things on spreadsheets and phone calls. I had identified the gap 3 years earlier at the job I'd left, and I had spent 2 years deciding whether it was real before I decided to make it real myself. I called it reaching. I had told almost no one. Not because I was ashamed of it. I wasn't. But because I had learned, through years of watching projects die in the open air of other people's opinions, that some things need to grow in private. They need room to fail without an audience. They need the space to be bad before they can become good. Andrea didn't know. I had planned to tell her. There were several moments when I almost did, but something held me back. That hesitation, in retrospect, was already an answer. When you're building something real, the people you love are usually the first to know. The fact that I was protecting this from her said something I hadn't been willing to say out loud. The months after the breakup were the hardest I had experienced in years. I was working 16-hour days in that Midtown office. My co-founder was a woman named Jess I'd known from my previous company, sharp, exacting, and with a higher tolerance for suffering than anyone I'd ever worked with. Together we burned through the first version of the product, realized it was wrong in 3 fundamental ways, scrapped 2 of those, and rebuilt them from scratch. The first major setback came in February. A logistics company in New Jersey had agreed to pilot the platform. 3 weeks in, their operations director decided the implementation was too disruptive during a busy quarter and pulled out of the agreement. It wasn't personal. It wasn't malicious. It was just business. But losing that pilot meant losing our clearest path to the data we needed to prove the product worked. Jess and I sat in that office the night it happened and didn't say much for a long time. We can find another pilot, she finally said. We will, I agreed. The second setback came in April. An investor who had seemed genuinely interested. 3 meetings, good energy, a lot of questions that felt like they were heading somewhere. Passed. His assistant sent an email. For sentences. The last one said he'd be happy to revisit if we gained more traction. If we gain more traction, which is the investor equivalent of, come back when you don't need us anymore. I went home that night and sat in my apartment for a long time doing nothing. Not watching anything, not reading anything. Just sitting with the weight of the question every founder hits eventually. The one that isn't really about the company, it's about you. Whether you're the kind of person this works out for. During this period, Andrea was visible on social media in the way she always had been. Curated, poised, appearing at events with people who wore the right things and worked at the right companies. I didn't follow her anymore, but mutual connections sometimes showed me things without meaning to. She looked exactly like someone who had made the right decision. I let myself feel that for about 30 seconds at a time. Then I went back to work. The call came when I had almost given up. His name was Lawrence Chun. He was a partner at a mid-sized venture firm that had made quiet, strategic bets on infrastructure software for the past decade and had been consistently right. He had found us through a contact of Jess's, read our deck on a flight, and called on a Thursday morning in late April. He asked good questions, uncomfortable ones, the kind that go looking for the weaknesses in your thinking and aren't satisfied until they find something. When I pushed back on one of his assumptions, calmly, with evidence, there was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Okay, I'd like to see the product." The first meeting with Lawrence's firm took 2 weeks to arrange, then 3 more meetings after that. I spent more time preparing for those conversations than I had spent on almost anything in my professional life. Every question they could ask, I had answered internally first, stress-tested the answer, refined it, answered it again. They invested in June. Not a massive sum. Enough to hire 2 engineers, refine the platform, and go back to market with something real. The second investor came in August, through Lawrence, who made a single call on our behalf that I will likely owe him for the rest of my career. That second investment was larger. It changed what we could build. By September, we had signed 3 pilot clients, real ones, with full agreements and implementation timelines. One of them, a regional freight company in the Midwest, sent us a message in October saying the platform had reduced their scheduling errors by 31% in the first 8 weeks. 31%. I remember reading that email at 11:30 at night and just sitting with it. Jess texted me at midnight. "Did you see the Thornfield number?" I replied, "Yeah." She sent back a single word, "Good." That was, in its way, one of the better nights of my life. It was around this time that Devin mentioned, with the kind of careful offhandness that means he'd been sitting on it for a while, that Andrea had apparently visited my LinkedIn profile several times in recent months. He knew because a mutual friend had mentioned it to him, who'd heard it from someone else, the particular telephone of a shared social circle. "Does that change anything for you?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded like he'd expected that. "Good," he said. "Just like Jess. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't stay with me for a moment. Not with any hope. That door was closed and I'd accepted that, but with something more complicated. Something close to wonder. She'd had a clear view of who I was, and she'd looked away. And now, from whatever distance, she was looking again. That was the first time I wondered if she regretted it. The invitation came from Preston Hale, who ran the Northeast Infrastructure and Logistics Summit, one of those conferences that had started small 15 years ago and grown, through the right keynotes and careful curation, into something the industry actually cared about attending. Preston had heard about Rechain from Lawrence, had looked at our pilot results, and reached out personally in late October. The summit was in March. He wanted me to be part of a panel on emerging technology and supply chain operations, and, separate from that, to have a table in the startup exhibition space where we could demo the platform. I said yes to both. The weeks before the conference were consumed with preparation. Jess and I worked with our team on the demo until every interaction was smooth, until I could answer questions about any part of the platform without hesitation, until the thing we'd built in that fluorescent-lit Midtown office felt like what it actually was, something real that solved a real problem for real companies. I didn't know who else was attending. The conference drew around 800 people across 2 days, operators, investors, consultants, technology vendors. I knew some of them by name, had interacted with a few by email. I didn't think much about the attendee list. On the evening before the conference, I had dinner alone at a restaurant near the hotel. I ordered a steak and a glass of wine and sat with the quiet that comes before something large. I thought about the office with the fluorescent lights. I thought about the email from Thornfield with the 31% number. I thought about Lawrence on that first phone call, asking uncomfortable questions and waiting, without impatience, for honest answers. I did not think about Andrea. Which is not to say I had stopped thinking about her altogether. Over the course of those 10 months she had appeared, and then receded, appeared and receded, the way something you've lost tends to move through your consciousness when you're not guarding against it. But I had made peace with what she had said, in the way you make peace with something that wounded you by growing into someone it no longer fits. The first morning of the summit, I arrived at the convention center at 7:30. Preston greeted me in the main hall, shook my hand, and walked me through the space. Our exhibition table was positioned well. The panel I was participating in was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. I set up the demo with our lead engineer, went over logistics, drank 2 cups of terrible conference coffee, and began the slow morning rhythm of a trade show. Conversations that start with business cards, handshakes across narrow aisles, the particular energy of an industry gathering where everyone is trying to seem like they've already arrived. By 11 o'clock, I had spoken to more people than I'd spoken to in the previous week combined. At 11:17, I glanced across the hall toward the registration area, and then I saw her. She hadn't seen me yet. Andrea was standing near the registration tables, badge in hand, talking to someone I didn't recognize. She looked exactly as she always looked at this kind of event, composed, dressed carefully, the particular alertness of someone who is both fully present and simultaneously cataloging the room. She was wearing a gray blazer I didn't recognize and had her hair the same way she used to wear it to things she considered important. Her badge said something below her name. An employer. A company I vaguely recognized as a mid-sized brand consultancy. I turned back to our table. For a moment, I felt something complicated move through me. Not dread, not anticipation exactly. Just the particular strangeness of the world folding in on itself. This city, this industry, this day. I let it pass. Someone came to the table with questions about integration timelines, and I answered them. And by the time that conversation ended, I had settled back into the work. I didn't know the exact moment she saw me. What I know is this. At some point in the mid-morning, I became aware, in the peripheral way you become aware of things without looking directly at them, of a presence nearby that had stopped moving. I was mid-conversation with an operations manager from a Chicago-based carrier when I noticed, at the edge of my field of vision, someone who had come close to our table and then stilled. I finished my sentence. I shook the operations manager's hand. I turned. She was standing about 10 feet away. The expression on her face went through several things in rapid succession: recognition, which I expected, and then something I didn't quite expect, which was confusion. Not hostility. Not embarrassment. Not yet. Just genuine cognitive confusion. The look of someone whose map of the world has just failed to match the territory. Her eyes moved from my face to our banner. The Rechain logo, clean and professional, the way Jess had insisted on it from the beginning. Then to the table with the demo setup. Then to the small cluster of people who had gathered, again, to ask questions. I nodded at her once. A greeting. Nothing more. She nodded back. And then Lawrence arrived. He came in the way Lawrence does everything. Without announcement. Without theater. Just appearing at the table and extending his hand and asking me how the morning had been. And I told him good. And he said he'd heard the same from 2 other people already. He said a firm he'd spoken to that morning had specifically mentioned Rechain in conversation. He was pleased in the restrained way of someone for whom understatement is a professional habit. He stayed for several minutes. I introduced him to our engineer. He asked a question about our roadmap for the second quarter, and I answered it. He shook my hand again before he left and said he'd see me at the afternoon panel. I looked up. Andrea hadn't moved. She was still standing at the same remove, and her expression had changed. The confusion had settled into something else. Not quite hurt, not quite awe. Something quieter than either. The look of someone doing arithmetic in their head that isn't coming out right. The morning continued. 2 more investors stopped at the table, both of whom I knew by then, one better than the other. There were conversations that ran long, demos that generated real questions and follow-up interest. A journalist asked if she could quote me in a piece she was writing about logistics technology. I said yes and spelled my name. At 1:30, Preston found me to walk me toward the panel room. He was effusive in the way conference organizers are when things are going well. He told me the session had more registered attendees than they'd expected. He introduced me to 2 of the other panelists in the green room, and I shook their hands. I didn't know what happened in the exhibition hall in my absence. I know what Jess told me afterward, that Andrea had approached the table while I was at the panel, that she had stood in front of the demo for a full minute without saying anything, that she had picked up one of the product brochures, looked at it, and set it down, that Jess, who knew nothing about her, had offered to answer any questions, that Andrea had said, quietly, no, thank you, and walked away. The panel itself was one of those sessions where the conversation finds a real frequency, where the questions from the moderator and the back and forth between panelists generates genuine friction rather than just performed expertise. I spoke when I had something specific to add. I didn't perform certainty I didn't have. I pushed back, once, on something another panelist said about adoption curves, and explained why I thought the resistance in mid-size operations came from a different place than he was identifying. There was a response from the room afterward that surprised me, a kind of hum, a shift in the energy, the particular sound of people paying attention differently. Afterward, Preston found me again in the hallway. "I'm going to have you on the keynote panel next year," he said. I said thank you. "Not a question," he said. "I'm telling you." He moved off to manage something else. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my phone in my hand and the afternoon light coming through the high windows. When I walked back into the main exhibition hall, Lance Whitfield, who I'd been hoping to meet for 3 months, was waiting at the rechain table. We talked for 22 minutes. He asked the same kind of good, hard questions that Lawrence had asked in April, and I answered them the same way I had then. Honestly, directly, without overselling and without false modesty. He said he wanted to schedule a proper conversation the following week. He took the card I gave him, and he meant it. Somewhere behind me, during that conversation, I became aware of her again. Just a presence at the edge of things. For the first time, she had nothing to say. She found me near the exit at around 5 o'clock, when the hall was beginning to empty and the energy of the day had softened into something more tired and honest. "Marcus." I turned. She was standing a few feet away, and she'd lost some of the composure of the morning. Not dramatically. Andrea didn't really do dramatic, but there was something around her eyes that looked like it had cost her something to come over here. "Hey," I said. "Do you have a minute?" I glanced around the thinning hall. "Sure." We moved to one of the standing tables near the far wall, out of the main traffic flow. She put her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment before she looked at me. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "I didn't know you would be either. I'm here with my company. We're looking at vendors." She paused. "Logistics tech vendors." "That's good," I said. "There are some strong ones here." Another pause. "This one longer. Rechain looks impressive, Marcus." "Thank you." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't know about any of this." "I know. Why didn't you?" "I wasn't ready to talk about it," I said. "And honestly, I wasn't sure it was going to work." She nodded slowly. "It worked." "It's working," I corrected. "Still a lot to build." She looked at me for a moment in a way I recognized from early in our relationship. The way she looked when someone surprised her genuinely. When something didn't fit the framework she'd already built for it. "I said something to you," she started. "Andrea." "No. I want to." I said something that wasn't fair. "You did," I agreed. No heat in it. Just acknowledgement. She searched for the word. I was measuring things I shouldn't have been measuring. Using the wrong measurements. I didn't say anything to that. I let it sit. "I'm sorry," she said. And I believed her. It was a real apology. Not the kind designed to open a door, but the kind someone says when they've been carrying something and need to set it down. "I appreciate that," I said. And I meant it. She looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of a question. The one I could see her considering. The one about whether there was anything here to revisit, any thread remaining. And then she seemed to decide against asking it. I respected her for that. "You seem good," she said instead. "I am good. I'm glad." There was a pause that was almost comfortable. Almost. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too." She gathered herself and walked back toward the main exit with the same composure she'd entered with, but carrying it differently now. I watched her go, and I felt something that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the particular warmth of being proven right. Just a kind of quiet. The kind that comes when something is finally, genuinely over. "Marcus." I turned. Casey Kim was a product designer I'd been introduced to through Lawrence's firm. She consulted with some of their portfolio companies, and we had been in sporadic email contact for 2 months. She was standing a few feet away with a conference badge still clipped to her jacket, and the kind of expression that suggests someone has been debating whether to come over. "I've been meaning to say something all day," she said. "Your panel this afternoon, the part about resistance to adoption, that was exactly right." "Thank you," I said. "I think a lot of people say the obvious thing and call it insight. You said the actual thing." I smiled. "I've had a lot of time to think about it." "Do you have time for coffee?" she said. "Or a drink? There's an industry thing at the hotel bar at 7, but I'd rather have an actual conversation." I thought about the morning. About the table with the banner. About Lawrence and Lance and Preston and 31%. About Andrea's face and the apology she'd offered without asking for anything back. About the office with the fluorescent lights, and Jess who never stopped, and the call that came when I had almost given up. About the version of myself that had left a restaurant without defending a single thing, because something in me already knew that the defense would come in a form that words couldn't carry. "Yeah," I said to Casey. "Let's get coffee." We walked out of the exhibition hall together, through the front doors, and into the cool evening air, the city resuming around us with its usual indifference and its usual aliveness. I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward people who had seen my worth long before success made it obvious. And it turned out that mattered more than any argument I could have won at a restaurant in February.